Good morning. My predecessors have made my task even more difficult than it was at the beginning. My title is Democracy Without Rights Possible? It's a very philosophical, analytical, conceptual title. And I was going to say something about the presuppositions of democracy and the situation of the challenges in democracy, liberal democracy. But the two lectures that opened the session were about the real challenges of democracy in our social political reality. And I will try and do what I think is the specific roles of scholars or academics. I will keep in some way to my original title in the sense that I will talk about the conceptual relationships in the way we are framing the debate. But I will say that there are three basic ideas here: liberalism, democracy, rights. They have very interesting and complex relations between them, and they are all of them very complex ideas. And that part of the problem and part of the responsibility of us scholars is to point out that there are issues in the way that we have structured thinking about the challenges, which in a way are not illuminating the challenges, but are really making it more difficult for us to understand what is at stake. Because I think that what is at stake is the presuppositions of democracy as a way of ruling societies, which are, on the one hand, real societies in which the demos is a real collective having a wish for some source of freedom, dignity, equality, but also solidarity, and a situation in which the connection between these three elements that are supposed to be the basis of democracy are not really easily existing in our social institutions in the democratic West. But I'm not going to talk directly about these issues. I'm going to refer to them, but I'm going to talk about the ways in which the way we think and talk about these issues either help or hinder us in understanding the problems. And what I would like to argue is that it is interesting, as we have heard, that the challenge of liberal democracy now comes from within. It's not a challenge of democracy from a non-democratic authoritarian regime, despite the fact that we can say that, say, China is a more effective and maybe not less responsive and accountable form of government than democracy. It's not that. What we are talking about is two conceptions of democracy, which are caricatured as one of them, democracy as majority vote, direct democracy. We were elected and we are not allowed to rule. And you, in fact, are talking about democracy, but you are philosopher kings or elites. You're not serving elites. You are just elites who are ignoring our interests. You're not allowing our elected officials to rule. But on the other hand, there is this democracy as rights thesis, saying that you cannot have an illiberal democracy, even if it does have the procedural guarantees of democracy, because democracy must be liberal, not in the formal political Rawlsian sense. Democracy must be liberal in the sense that it incorporates liberal progressive politics. And the goal of democracy is not just letting the people decide who rules them and how, but also to vote for the people who are the right rulers. And if we are not successful in the ballots, then we will be successful by using our machines for constraining the elected officials to really force democracy to do the right thing in the liberal sense. So this ambiguity about what liberal democracy is is part of the problem that hinders us in understanding the immanent internal tensions between democracy and human rights, or democracy and liberalism, in the sense not of allowing everyone the legitimacy of fighting so that you can have a conservative government, a nationalist government that is legitimate as long as it obeys the rules of the game of democracy, including the checks and balances, but conservative government is illegitimate because it's not liberal. So what I would like to argue is that democracy, in its thinnest, most procedural sense, is not majority rule. Democracy is a very complex ideal which does say that the morality of political power is being accountable to the people. And the people is the demos. We heard that it used to be some aristocratic, not universal suffrage people, and it's definitely part of the changes. But the people are the actual people, not what the people should think, what they should want. This is respect for the choices of the people. And if the people want solidarity, and if the people want to control the borders of the demos, then you should take this very seriously. And the test of that is that the elected branches of government, the institutionalized aspect of democracy, the elected branches of government should be allowed to have a large realm of free decision-making. So the accountability of democracy means that the government has the mandate to do its policy, which may be controversial, because it's fighting against other possible policies in the marketplace of democracy. But democracy also is limited government, checks and balances, and constraints. And a democratic government is the elected government acting within the institutional and moral constraints of democracy and human rights. Now, for this to happen, we need a sense of demos as a real community, and we've heard that this has weakened in today's world in very important senses. But we also need a system of institutions that is autonomous to a large extent from the outcomes of these institutions. Because democracy is indeed procedural. And it's, I think, wrong of supporters of liberal democracy to say that democracy is a democracy of rights. And if democracy doesn't generate protection of full rights and dignity and all of this kind of thing, then this democracy is a lesser democracy. It's not only less of a protector of human rights. I think this is a mistake because this may mean that we erode two critical distinctions in democracy. Democracy that assumes that there are conflicts of interests and conflicts of visions of the good life in democracy, and that democracy is there to allow the peaceful negotiation of these differences into a system of decision-making that binds all and reduce the danger of civil war and rebellion. This is, I think, the basis of the idea of democracy, and it's not only prudential, it's a real moral thing because it does involve freedom to elect, to vote, to know, to organize, and it does involve what we call civil and political rights, and it doesn't involve the civic equality of one person, one vote, and the idea that it's better to have the majority decide than have a minority to have a veto power. All these are basic ideas of democracy, but they are linked to the vision that is also the vision of human rights, which is a humanistic tradition of the importance of individuals and groups and the distinction that Berlin introduced between positive freedom, which is the kind of freedom that democracy stands for, the freedom to decide how I'm going to be ruled, and the freedom of non-interference, which is the suspicion of the power of government to tell me how I should act. Now, human rights are connected and linked and have affinities with democracy in at least three ways. A, human rights are necessary in democracy for political rights. You cannot have a democracy without political rights, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of organization, parties, all of this. A country without these, without a real way of talking about government and choosing government and changing government, multi-party system, countries and societies without this are not only not protecting human rights, they're not democracies. But human rights are moral constraints imposed on individuals and states and majorities by the idea of humanism and human dignity. They are pre-state, they are not related to majorities, they are not supposed to represent the solidarity of a particular demos with its own history, territory, and needs. It's supposed to strengthen solidarity of humanity at large. Human rights are the rights of people qua people, not as citizens of a particular country. So you have a general human right to participate in the government of your community, but this is a universal right that is, in a sense, a right to be different and decide for yourself within your community how your community is going to look like, including if you have people who think that nationalism, community, this kind of solidarity, religion, all kind of non-civic affiliations are very important ways of thinking about your welfare as individuals and as groups, that this must have a legitimate force within the democratic debate in your country. So I think that one of the challenges of what we call liberal democracy is to maintain the legitimacy of an attempt within a given society to think that it's legitimate for us as a demos to try and promote the welfare of ourselves as a distinct demos. And our constraints are of two kinds. One constraint is the set of the procedural limited government checks and balances, elected, non-elected institutions, which is very, very important. But the other set of constraints is indeed substantive, and this is human rights, which is external to some extent. Now, I think that a mistake in liberal theory in the strong sense is that it is willing to say that human rights belong to democracy, and both of them belong to the shared part of political institutions. And this is why they cannot be a matter of partisan politics. They must be beyond partisan politics. Now, it is true that a democracy requires a shared system of values that will form the basis of the solidarity of the demos. If a demos doesn't have a deep solidarity, the society that is supposed to govern by democracy cannot flourish. If the demos of a given society is so divided that it doesn't have a sense that it wants to maintain its life as a distinct political community, then democracy is going to be weaker. But not only democracy is going to be weaker, human rights in that society are going to be weaker. Because a society in which human rights are conceived to be only a part of the shared rules of the game imposed from the outside, by international NGOs, things like that, if they don't come from the very self-identity, the culture of the communities that form the demos, if human rights are seen only as external constraints, the feeling of alienated people that what they should fight against as part of democracy is the power of these external constraints may be extremely dangerous. Now, how is this translated into institutions, which I think is very, very critical? Human rights, as I said, is about the solidarity of humanity at large. So necessarily, it doesn't have in itself the power of enforcement of a municipal legal system. A municipal legal system, in principle, is supposed to be controlled by the rule of law. But in principle, in a democracy, the main task of making the laws is of the legislature, the elected officials of the country. Now, the elected officials of the country are constrained by their force, the limits of their force, but also by checks and balances. So now the real question within a system is, how are these checks and balances decided? I think that in order to maintain the inclusivity of the demos and the legitimacy of conflicts of interest and disagreements, what you have to do is to insist that the shared part is minimal, is thin, is seriously inclusive. When you succeed in doing that, the legitimacy of all powers of government is built indeed on the shared part. But the legitimacy is also and primarily a legitimacy of the elected government to promote its own policy within the constraints of the system. So we all have an interest in the shared part, but we all have an interest that the shared part will not preempt the differences and the disagreements in our society. Now, democracy is a problematic regime because it has a way of encouraging a distinction between campaigning and ruling. Ruling is supposed to be the usual mode of democracy. Ruling means that the elite, the power, the government is of the people, by the people, accountable to the people, but for the people, people being the demos. Problem with other kinds of countries, with other kinds of peoples. But if you are seriously to be that, then you need, when you are a ruler, you need to act out of the public interest in a way, despite the fact that you think that the public interest is best served by promoting your own policies, which is how you ran and how you were elected. In the campaign period, which is supposed to be relatively short and decent, you insist on stressing the differences between you and your rivals. You want to explain why they should vote for you, not for them. So you are, and maybe, you probably, we hope you are responsible and you're not divisive and you respect the shared part and human rights, but we also understand that you need to stress the differences. But once you are elected, once you succeeded in persuading the majority of the people that you are the one, or coalition, then your basis of legitimacy is not only your electoral base. And this, in principle, could work because then the responsibility of the political leader is both to their own electoral base, but also to the community at large. When you have a community in which the solidarity of the demos is superficial or very problematic indeed, And when we have, as a result of social media and some other problems, a mode of permanent campaigning, there is no security of political power, so you constantly need to campaign, then you constantly need to do the divisiveness of campaigning other than the civic unity and the strengthening of the nation, civic nation building of the ruling phase. And I think this is part of what we are seeing in many countries. So what can we do, I think, in terms of thinking about the issues? We do have different politics. And our political goals ultimately is what decides our preferences and our vote. That is, at least it should be. In some countries it's become so complicated. In Israel today now, just wanting to get rid of Bibi is now so paramount that it really is more powerful politically than any other policy idea. But hopefully we'll transcend this soon and we can get back to some kind of politics. So what we need, I think, to do is to maintain the real balance between letting the people decide who they want to rule them by their platform, and then having a system that accepts that the shared part is critical to the strength of a democracy, and it's part of democracy. So human rights are a part of democracy. But they alone, neither democracy nor human rights alone, can dictate a meaningful life and a solution to political problems. This is the task of effective governments and of political, social, cultural, religious leaders of the community. This cannot be relegated to be the task of gatekeepers who, by an expansive rights discourse, get the power to both force and limit the power of an elected government to do what it takes to promote its own vision, as long as they do it within the constraints. But the constraints cannot become a way for the opposition, the group that loses at the ballots. The constraints cannot become the way for the people who keep losing in the ballots to control what the country will say, because then both parts, the loser and the winners, are fighting against democracy. Because democracy requires that a political rival is a legitimate political rival. If your political rival is an enemy of the people and a traitor, then you are an anti-democratic force, because what you want is not let the people decide. You want to let you or someone else decide what is right. And you must allow that measure of decision to the electoral processes with all their difficulties. Now, I agree that our situation is ambivalent and ambiguous in very, very interesting ways, because there are still people fighting for democracy, really fighting for the right to decide in dignity how they are going to be ruled, and they want to be ruled by a democratic regime. But there are many people in the democratic world who lose the understanding that democracy will be neither viable nor stable unless there is some legitimacy, not full legitimacy. There is some legitimacy to the idea that a necessary requirement of a stable democracy is the right and the duty to build solidarity within the demos, which includes persuading the people that your policy and human rights are indeed a part of their commitment to stable democracy. So I think for us as academics, not as citizens and as public intellectuals, as academics, one of the legal academics, one of the contribution is to say that the relations between the powers, the procedural, institutional guarantees are the protectors of democracy, but under some interpretations, they may indeed generate and feed some of the alienation and anger and disappointment that we have been hearing about. Because we want a government that will be democratic, that we can change, but also effective government that can do what we think is right. And we should be educated as citizenry to think that democracy can and should support a demos that is educated and a demos that decides in a way that trusts their elites to be serving elites to all of them. And the demos, I repeat, is not the whole humanity. The demos requires, of course, attention to humanity and human rights and global interests and climate and all of that stuff. We don't need irresponsibility. But it's legitimate and critical for human rights and for the ideas of checks and balances and limited power to be parts of the idea of democracy shared by all of us. So no one should be dubbed an enemy of the people and a traitor. And this should apply to both sides of the political spectrum. Thank you.